Great. So I'd suggest we start, and I'm very happy to introduce Alexia Florentine and Kathleen Rice to our talk today. Alexia is a licensed professional counselor, licensed chemical dependency counselor in Texas, and a national certified counselor, originally originating from Buenos Aires. She earned her PhD in counselor education and supervision and various other titles. I won't read them out loud. She has 9 years of experience and has her own private practice and served as a bilingual clinician in several mental health and addiction rehab centers. And her research centers on the intersectionality of family systems, ambiguous loss, and resilience within the context of addiction, and how acculturation, trauma, and intergenerational struggles affect the Latinx community in the context of resilience and cultural and linguistic adaptations of evidence-based interventions in bilingual counseling and supervision. And she has a tenure track full-time faculty at Texas State University, where she also serves as an educator and mentor. And Kathleen Rice is a professor of counselor education and the doctoral program coordinator at the Sam Houston State University. She's a licensed professional counselor, supervisor, mental health counselor, professional counselor, national certified counselor, and approved clinical supervisor. Her scholarly research activity focus on counselor supervision and training with an emphasis in ethical considerations, which is really interesting, and the implications of historical and generational trauma and the impact of substance abuse on individuals, families, and the community. And the topic of today's talk will be holding on and letting go, supporting families through ambiguous loss in addiction. And before I hand over to you, I would like to remind all people who are here that I think this is around the 40th webinar as far as I have counted. And as a small charity, we always welcome donations to keep this tradition alive. So we would be really grateful if you could consider to support AFINet. And of course, I also would like to advertise AFINet's virtual conference on September 15 and 16th. And all information can be found on the website. So I'm handing over to Alexia and Kathleen, and after your talk, there will be an opportunity for questions. And if you have any questions or comments during the talk, use the chat function. And yeah, I think we should be able to address them all. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear and see me okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Yes, we can.
Well, thank you. So the title of our webinar is Holding On and Letting Go, Supporting Families Through Ambiguous Loss and Addiction. Dr. Rice and I were invited to present here today in response to our most recent publication in February in the International Journal of Substance Use and Addiction Treatment. And both this webinar and this research and our publication were based on my dissertation that I completed to meet the requirements of my PhD in 2024. So you've already heard a little bit about our educational background, but we thought it was really important for us to also share our clinical background and our experiences working with this population. I've had clinical experiences working in community mental health as a case manager, as an addictions counselor in addiction rehab centers, and in group and private practice as a mental health therapist. And I still keep up with my private practice today, as does Dr. Rice. And During my years at the Addiction Rehabilitation Rehab in Houston, Texas, I helped to develop a curriculum for family-centered work, and I ran family support groups every single week for a whole 3 years straight, rain or shine, even during holidays. I was there running those family support groups. And I thought it was also important for us to highlight our own deeply personal experiences with loved ones going in and out of addiction. And usually that's how research works, right? Is we're not only asking these questions and identifying these patterns, not only because of our own immersion in the work, but sometimes because of our own personal connection with it. So this research is really important to me.
Okay. Similarly, I've been working, I started running groups for clients that were mandated to counseling for their addiction instead of going to prison. But I've also run groups in different prisons. I did that for a number of years. Then I transitioned into working. I'm originally from South Dakota, and we have a part of my heritage and is Native American, and we have a large Native American population in South Dakota. And I worked with juveniles that had comorbid addiction and substance use that had been removed from their families and were in what they call them Indian boarding schools. That's what they're called in the United States. And so I worked for many years with the adolescents there. Now I'm a full-time professor, but I do have a part-time practice, and my specialty is generational trauma. And specifically, I work with a lot of families that have a loved one that has they've lost the loved one through addiction, or the loved one is currently in addiction. And also, like many of us, I have a family history of it. My dad is one of 14 um, siblings, and lots of different combinations going on there where addiction has impacted it. So it is personal to us, and it is very important that this work be shared. So we just so appreciate the opportunity that you're giving us to share our work.
So our webinar is designed to be interactive in nature with our participants. So if you could just scan that QR code, it'll lead you to our very first interactive question, which is just what country are you located in? We want to get a feel for where our participants are tuning in from. This is all anonymous, and so just share your responses as you'd like.
You're assuming, by the way, people actually have phones available and can do QR codes. Don't forget, we're not all technically proficient here.
Yes.
Some of us are on computers, and trying to do a QR code on a computer is always very difficult.
So there's a code. You can go to slidco, I'm not gonna say right, sliddo.com, and you can put the number in there to do it by computer.
You can do that on your
Yeah.
computer. That's useful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We give you two options.
Right,
options.
brilliant.
All right.
Really cool.
Yeah. All right. Alexa, you ready?
Yeah. Thanks for
Okay.
sharing, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so our second interactive question is, what is your current role? Are you maybe a counseling professor, counselor supervisor, researcher, policymaker, educator, affected family member?
And you only put one down?
You can put more than one.
Okay.
Lots of researchers.
Yeah. All right.
Equal numbers of practitioners. Oh, no, Yeah, practitioners are overtaking. Mhm.
Mm-hmm. It'll start getting competitive. Start putting them in there.
Come on, educators, you can do it. Get up there.
Lots
All
of different
right.
roles.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
So now going over our learning objectives for this webinar, of course, we want to define what ambiguous loss is and explain its relevance to family members and substance use disorders. Want to help describe the roles of hope and resilience in mitigating ambiguous loss. Talk about our own research and our empirical findings from our quantitative study of 708 affected family members across the US, and hopefully learn to apply at least 2 evidence-informed clinical strategies to support these family members, not only in clinical work, but in research, training context, supervision, and policy.
All right. So thinking it's just kind of instantaneous. What's one word or phrase of how families describe living with a loved one who has an addiction? What would be one word that comes to mind for y'all? Complex? Absolutely. Yeah. Stressful? Yeah. Hopeless? Chaos? Nightmare? Um, Isolating? Emotional? Yeah. The more someone puts a word in, the bigger it gets. That's where you see here where chaos is kind of the biggest word because that's what most people are putting in to it. Yeah, all these things are true. Um, it is. It's frustrating. Absolutely. Um, absolutely. All right. So let's dive a little bit deeper into helpless. Oh, that became a big one. Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Very true. All right. Thank you guys very much. So kind of the first part we're going to talk about is why families matter. You guys had a lot of words that came up that kind of describe that. So we want to dive a little bit more into that. So first, kind of looking at the scope of the problem, you're going to see on our slides, we have specific statistics regarding the United States. But looking internationally, according to the World Health Organization, about 400 million people of the world's populations 18-15 and older live with an alcohol use disorder. And then there's another 64 million that live with an addiction to a substance other than alcohol. However, these statistics, they really do not capture the whole impact of addiction as they only focus on the person with the addiction and not by the people that are affected by it. Unfortunately, we don't have one single number that globally estimates the number of people affected by a loved one's addiction because most studies are focused on the person who has the addiction, not the affected family members. However, we can make some reasonable estimates based on that, right? So many experts say about 4 to 10 people are affected by a loved one's substance use. This leads us to considering if we look at the number of people that have been found to have a substance disorder, we're looking at 1.9 to 4.6 billion people worldwide may be impacted by a loved one's addiction. From a family systems perspective, addiction fundamentally alters relational functioning. Families frequently organize around the addiction in ways that promote short term stability, but inadvertently maintain long term dysfunction. Thus, many of the relational patterns we observe clinically persist well beyond after the person with the addiction is in recovery. Okay. So let's kind of look at specifically at the affected family member, what we're going to call the AFM. Um, so you know that the little acronym we're going to use for that. Affected family members frequently provide practical, emotional, and financial support to loved ones with addiction while simultaneously coping with the significant interpersonal strain. Those are all those words that y'all provided. As a result, they often experience elevated symptoms of anxiety and depression, relationship strain, economic hardship, interpersonal conflict, and profound grief over the loss of the relationship as it existed before addiction. This form of relational grief is frequently overlooked despite its significant impact on family well being. For this reason, addiction is increasingly conceptualized as a family disease rather than solely an individual disorder. Treatment outcomes are influenced not only by reductions in substance use, but also by improvements in family functioning, interpersonal relationships, and social support. Although the National Certification Commission for Addiction Professionals recognizes family counseling as one counseling modality within the addiction treatment, its certification standards and ethical guidelines do not provide dedicated competencies or practice guidelines for the assessment and treatment of family members that are affected by addiction. Dr. Florentine and I sought to address this gap in this research by examining one of the most overlooked experiences reported by family members living with addiction, ambiguous loss. So let's dive in a little bit and understand a little bit more about ambiguous loss. To understand the experiences of family members affected by addiction, it's helpful to view them through Pauline Boss's theory of ambiguous loss. Boss defines ambiguous loss as a loss that lacks clarity or resolution, a situation where closure is not possible and learning to live with uncertainty becomes the goal. Boss describes two types of ambiguous loss. First is the physical ambiguous loss, where the loved one is physically absent but remains psychologically present. This would be such as an immigration situation, deployment, or a missing person. The second, and the one most relevant to addiction, is psychological ambiguous loss, where a loved one is physically present but psychologically absent. Individuals struggling with addiction may still be living at home or coming in and out of the home, but because of the substance use, they are emotionally unavailable, cognitive impairment. Family members often feel as though this person they knew is no longer there. Boss describes this experience as goodbye without leaving. Families frequently say things like, he's here, but he's not really here. I keep waiting for the person I married to come back. I miss my son. Where did my son go? Unlike death, there is no socially recognized process for grieving this type of loss. As a result, this uncertainty freezes the grief process. Family members often fluctuate between hope and despair, making it difficult to adapt, establish boundaries, and know how to move forward. While ambiguous loss can occur in many life circumstances, addiction creates a particularly unique and challenging form of this because of its unpredictable nature. Families often experience repeated cycles of active substance abuse, treatment, recovery, and relapse, making it difficult to know what to expect or how to emotionally adapt. As Pauline Boss suggests, family members affected by ambiguous loss often become caught in a cycle of hope and despair. Each period of recovery brings renewed optimism, while each relapse can feel like experiencing the loss all over again. This ongoing uncertainty is emotionally exhausting and prevents families from fully grieving or fully moving forward. Clinically, this uncertainty can impair coping, decision making, and relational clarity. Family members often struggle with questions such as, should I continue hoping? Should I set firmer boundaries? Should I stay? Or is it time for me to tell them this relationship's over? These are not simple relational questions. They are responses to living with the chronic ambiguity. Unlike conventional grief following a death, There are no recognized social rituals for this type of loss. Friends and professionals may not fully understand the experience because a loved one is still physically present. As a result, family members often feel isolated, invalidated, and unsupported. For addictions counselors, this framework is valuable because it shifts our focus away from helping families achieve closure and towards helping them tolerate uncertainty, build resilience, and find meaning despite the ongoing uncertainty. Understanding ambiguous loss also provides an important foundation for recognizing the unique ethical and clinical needs of families affected by substance use disorders. While ambiguous loss appears to be a universal phenomenon, the way it is experienced and expressed is influenced by culture. Factors such as collectivism, family roles, stigma surrounding addiction, and access to stigma about behavioral health services can shape how families respond to this ongoing uncertainty. Recognizing these cultural influences is something that we need to consider as practitioners and educators. So that kind of leads us to where we're at looking where the kind of gap in the research was. While there is substantial body of research examining the effects of addictions in families, very little quantitative research has specifically examined ambiguous loss among affected family members. Much of what we know comes from qualitative studies and clinical observations rather than empirical measurement. Those qualitative studies consistently describe themes of hope, resilience, uncertainty, and ongoing grief. Family members often talk about living between optimism and disappointment, adapting to chronic uncertainty, and finding ways to continue functioning despite the unpredictable nature of addiction. However, these findings raise an important question. Can these experiences be measured? And do hope and resilience actually influence how individuals experience ambiguous loss? This led to the central question in our study. Do hope and resilience matter? And if so, for whom? More specifically, we wanted to examine whether hope and resilience predicted ambiguous loss among family members affected by a loved one's substance use disorder and whether these relationships differed across demographic characteristics. Our goal was to move beyond descriptive accounts and begin building an empirical foundation that would ultimately inform both clinical practice and ethical decision making when working with families affected by addiction.
So in this section, we're going to cover what we did for our study. We'll talk about how our study was designed, who participated in our research, what instruments we used to collect data, how we went about data collection, how that data was analyzed. So we're going to be talking about lots of research terms today, which I feel like is totally okay because we have a lot of researchers here. So a quick overview of our research study, we used a cross-sectional design, right? That's like taking a snapshot to see what your participants are doing and what's happening right now, using a quantitative approach in a positivist paradigm, which is very true to quantitative research. Our sample size was 708 affected family members across the United States, again, with that definition of an AFM being spouses, parents, siblings, adult children, and close friends that are considered like family. Recruitment was online via Qualtrics, which is an online platform for online survey creation and distribution. And Qualtrics, what they did, which was really awesome, is they conducted a preliminary soft launch of our survey that allowed for those initial assessment of response patterns before we did a full-scale implementation of our survey. And my favorite thing that Qualtrics did was they undertook that meticulous data refinement process, which not only included the removal of incomplete surveys, but also bot-generated responses. So we did not have to worry about the bots infiltrating our study, which has been like a very recent modern trend for modern day quantitative researchers. And Qualtrics obviously ensured adherence to security standards, made sure that our participant information was kept confidential using de-identification measures, and of course, we were granted institutional review board approval by Sam Houston State University to start and conduct this research. So now looking at our participant demographics, so out of the 708 participants that finished and completed all components of our research survey, even though ages varied from 18 to over 85 years old, the data showed that the largest number of our participants were around 35 to 44 years old. Gender was pretty much split down the middle, but a little over half of our participants identified as female. 62.6% of our participants identified as white, while 37.4% were from diverse backgrounds to include African American, American Indian, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and Hispanic. And then relationship to the person with a substance use disorder varied. 17.1% of our participants were spouses or partners of individuals struggling with substance use disorders. And then the second largest percentage was someone having a best friend who is struggling with a substance use disorder, which again, the research counts as an affected family member, and which I personally thought was really interesting. 13.4% were siblings, and then 21.6% had multiple relationships with a loved one with an SUD, right? Meaning that it wasn't just a spouse, it was maybe also a parent or an uncle or a cousin, etc. And then a big demographic finding that came from this very large sample size was that 54.2% of our participants had never had any experiences with receiving support or therapy services, which obviously wasn't a very happy statistics, but it just tells us obviously that families are in dire need of services. Now, looking into the three instruments that we used to measure ambiguous loss, hope, and resilience. First, we used the Ambiguous Loss Inventory Plus, which was developed in 2023 using Dr. Pauline Boss's ambiguous loss theory that Dr. Rice was talking about earlier. And this inventory measures the psychological, relational, and existential aspects of ambiguous loss. But we used part 3 specifically for the study because it measured the psychological reactions to ambiguous loss. And a fun fact about this assessment actually is that it was not open access. So I literally had to email Dr. Comtesi, which was the first author of this assessment, who is a professor at a university in Germany, to ask for permission to use this assessment in my study. So I felt like it was a really cool email exchange for me as a doc student to have this professor in Germany grant me access to use her scale for my dissertation. And then the second assessment that was used for the purposes of the study is the Adult Hope Scale, which was developed in 1991 by Snyder et al. To measure hope in adults who are facing adversity. This scale is open access, so you could literally Google search it and find it and use it. And it measures 2 components of hope, which is agency, the ability to initiate and sustain action towards goals, and then pathways, which is the ability to generate a pathway to achieve those goals. And then the third assessment that we used was the Brief Resilient Coping Scale, also an open access scale that you could literally find on Google. It was developed in 2004 by Sinclair and Walston to measure an individual's ability to cope with stress and adversity in a resilient way. And then the data collected from all of these assessments was analyzed using SPSS, using a multiple regression approach, which examines how different factors work together to influence something, right? So when we think of a multiple regression approach, we think of like 3 Venn diagrams coming together, and then our study was trying to look at what's going on in the middle there. Okay, so here's where we get to talking about and answering our research questions. So multiple regression analysis was conducted to first determine that first research question: are there differences in the ways that hope and resilience impact ambiguous loss in our affected family members? And the results showed that the regression model was statistically significant because that p-value was below 0.001, indicating that hope and resilience together predict ambiguous loss outcomes in our affected family members of individuals struggling with substance use disorders. And then looking at the individual factors separately, hope, which was measured by the Adult Hope Scale, had a statistically significant relationship with ambiguous loss. Again, that p-value was below 0.001, meaning that higher levels of hope in family members equals lower levels of ambiguous loss that they're feeling. And then our second individual predictor, resilience, which we measured using the Brief Resilient Coping Scale, was also having a statistically significant relationship with ambiguous loss. That p-value was under 0.001, meaning again that higher levels of resilience account for lower levels of ambiguous loss in our affected family members. I also wanted to point out that there was a difference in that hope had a slightly stronger association compared to resilience. So we see that hope was 0.28 and resilience was negative 0.23, meaning that while both hope and resilience significantly contributed to predicting lower levels of ambiguous loss, hope may play a more dominant role in coping with ambiguous loss. And we'll get into the clinical implications and what this means later, but this also alludes to the fact that addiction counselors may be needing to focus more on hope building strategies with our family members because, again, the numerical and statistical research shows that they have a stronger relationship. And then the second research question, would these hold up in a parsimonious model? Meaning, was the first regression really accurate? Let's run another regression to double check it. And it did hold up, meaning that both hope and resilience have had a significant negative effect. Again, reinforcing that the higher hope and resilience we feel, the lower ambiguous loss we experience. And then for our final research question, we ran a moderation analysis to explore whether demographic factors like age, gender, and relationship type to the individual with a substance use disorder moderated the relationship between hope, resilience, and ambiguous loss outcomes. And then that first bullet point, among the demographic factors, age had a significant negative main effect on ambiguous loss, which suggested that older AFMs experience lower levels of ambiguous loss. The qualitative research out there truly supports and justifies this numerical value, saying that, the older you are, the more experience you have in life, so you might not be as impacted maybe as someone younger. And then that second bullet point there under research question 3, relationship to a loved one with an SUD didn't show a significant effect, but it showed a positive main effect, indicating that the closer relationships you have, like whether you're a spouse or a parent or a sibling, the higher ambiguous loss experience that you'll have, which also kind of makes sense, right? So the closer you are to someone, the more grief you feel when they disappear. And then in terms of the moderation effects, none of the interactions between hope, resilience, and all three demographic factors were statistically significant. Again, meaning that counselors don't specifically have to tailor interventions to age, gender, or relationship type specifically, and that counseling interventions on hope and resilience could potentially be effective across these three demographic groups without needing any modifications for age, gender, or relationship type. So that's what our numerical values claimed, which pretty much justified the qualitative research that's already out there that Dr. Rice went over. So that was a lot. Were you surprised by these findings? Or if you want to type something in the chat, what surprised you about these findings? No. We are not surprised. I love that. Yeah, so basically, it just justified the qualitative research already out there. So now we want to head into talking about what all of these results and numbers mean for clinical practice, especially as researchers and practitioners out there. And so I also go over some clinical suggestions for building hope and resilience when you're working with family members. So how do these results align with what the literature on hope says? So the results of our study proved Snyder's qualitative findings with numbers of a key theme that hope is particularly effective in navigating uncertainty and loss, meaning that as counselors, it's really important to intervene here first and incorporate hope-building strategies into our therapeutic practice. So using theories like solution-focused therapy to help family members envision a hopeful future, or goal-setting interventions to help families identify small, achievable goals for themselves, maybe focusing on what family members can control in their relationships with their loved ones versus what they actually can't, or helping them just envision a more hopeful future. And then another intervention that could help, and that has actually helped in my own clinical work, is narrative reframing. So helping affected family members reconnect with their own identity beyond the caregiver role, right? Helping them identify and pursue goals related to their own relationships, their own health, their own creativity or work, just helping them restore that sense of agency that ambiguous loss systematically tends to remove, really. And then again, our research showed that hope building works across different demographic groups because those interactions, again, were not statistically significant. So these interventions are applicable broadly. And then in terms of clinical suggestions based on our study's findings to build resilience in family members, cognitive behavioral strategies like adaptive coping mechanisms, cognitive reframing, and problem solving are also interventions that can be helpful. Mindfulness-based stress reduction and emotional regulation can be incorporated to help family members understand ways to sit with their feelings of discomfort in a healthy way, right? So how do we sit with our feelings? We validate our feelings, we try to understand our feelings, and we lean into the discomfort in a healthy way, saying like, I don't like this very much, but I'm okay. And it's also important that as clinicians, we emphasize the need for more family sessions for family members, specifically with their loved one in recovery, to facilitate more open communication and dialogue. And then also, of course, psychoeducation on ambiguous loss is really important. Like, let me tell you about ambiguous loss. What does that look like for you? Even a statement like, you are grieving someone who is still here can be a statement that really validates years of unexpressed pain. Let's talk about it so that I can support you in navigating this complicated grief, because we know that naming the loss not only validates the experience, but it reduces self-blame. And then, of course, had to add that tidbit in there, always making sure to consider cultural context when selecting your modalities, especially for collectivist families where individual focused coping may conflict with maybe some family obligations. Very important. All right, so now we want you to think of an affected family member that you have worked with or currently work with. What was one moment when hope and resilience showed up? What helped create that moment? What do you think helped in the moment? What did you do? What came up? Whatever thoughts you guys want to share with us. Your peer support, supporting each other through it. Especially when we're running those family groups, the AFM experience can be sometimes really shameful. When AFMs identify suitable strategies for themselves, reflection on their own progress, realization that they can't change or control, right? The 3 C's: I cannot control and I cannot cure, but maybe I understand that maybe I have contributed in some way, but I can't control it. Getting reassurance and just a confirmation that they also deserve support, independent of that family member, right? The research out there, and even just like our own clinical work, is so focused in helping the person in their recovery that sometimes we overlook the family member that has gone through years of this. Realizing that things can and do change. And that's where that component of hope comes in. Realizing that they have choices over what to do, that empowerment. Seeing their problem also as a chronic condition. Looking for glimmers of hope or small changes that they can make. Thanks for sharing.
All right. Dr. Florentine discussed the clinical implications of the findings of the study. Now we're going to take a focus on what this means for educators, clinical supervisors, and professional policy. So our findings have important implications not only for that clinical practice, but also for as we prepare educators, especially addictions counselors with that. For counselor educators, we believe ambiguous law should be intentionally integrated into addiction counseling curricula. Many counselors are well trained to recognize trauma, grief, and family system dynamics, but fewer have language for the unique experience of having a loved one who is physically present, yes, yet psychologically absent. I'm teaching addictions counseling this semester, and when I bring up ambiguous loss, I ask how many of them have ever heard of it. The percentages are zero that they've heard of. So it's really important that we're introducing it. Um, Incorporating case-based learning, role plays, grief-focused pedagogy can help counselors in training recognize ambiguous loss and include it in their case conceptualizations. Just as importantly, we should teach students to help clients name this experience. Many family members report relief simply from learning that what they're experiencing has a name and is recognized as a psychological phenomenon. Um, I say all the time, information is power. And when we give information to clients, when we educate clients, that helps them feel like they have a little more control. For supervisors, this framework can strengthen both supervision and client care. Supervisors can model strength-based case conceptualization by helping supervisees identify not only distress, but also hope, resilience, and adaptive coping strategies families develop while living with chronic uncertainty. I find, especially with new counselors in training, they have a tendency to focus more on the pathology than on anything that might be working in the positive, the more strength based. So, focusing on that hope and resilience is really important. Supervision is also an ideal place to coach clinicians in delivering psychoeducation, supporting healthy boundaries, selecting interventions that acknowledge ongoing uncertainty rather than focusing solely on symptom reduction. Finally, because addiction affects the entire family system, supervision should reinforce ethically responsive care. This includes helping counselors recognize which family members may need assessment, support, or referral, even if they are not the identified client. Preparing counselors to think systematically and ethically ultimately leads to more comprehensive, family centered addiction treatment. However, preparing counselors to provide family centered care is only one part of the solution. To fully support affected family members, our professional standards, ethical frameworks must all reflect this systemic approach. This brings us to broader policy implications. Our findings can have important implications for policy and practice. As we reviewed before the NCCAP Code of Ethics, we found that references to family are largely limited to issues such as confidentiality, dual relationships, and assessment. The code does not provide explicit guidance regarding the assessment, support, or treatment of family members affected by loved one's substance use disorder, despite decades of evidence demonstrating that addiction is a family disease. Our findings suggest that this is an area worthy of continued discussion with the profession. If affected family members experience significant ambiguous loss, chronic grief, and psychological distress, then our ethical frameworks and treatment standards should more explicitly acknowledge their needs. From a policy perspective, this means moving towards family-centered addiction care. Members should have routine access to psychoeducation, family counseling, support services, and referral pathways, not as optional adjuncts, but as part of a comprehensive addiction treatment. It is a call for us to ask, what does family-centered addiction policy look like in your country or healthcare system? The specific models may differ based on culture, healthcare infrastructure, and available resources, but the underlying principle remains the same: supporting the individual with a substance use disorder, also means recognizing and supporting the family members who are living with its effects. Ultimately, our hope is that this work contributes to a broader conversation about integrating ambiguous loss into addiction counseling, counselor education, and future ethical and policy development.
So now we're going to move into the final section of this webinar where we will give recommendations for future research and sort of wrap up what we learned today. So we believe that future research in this area could consider longitudinal studies because longitudinal designs could give us more insights into how hope, resilience, and ambiguous loss evolve over time, maybe like based on someone's SUD type, like alcohol, opiates, or benzos, severity of their addiction, or just number of relapses over a period of time. We also believe that incorporating mixed methods approaches in the future could also provide a broader and more complete understanding of the lived experience of an affected family members. Like interviews could complement survey data by offering just detailed accounts of the personal experiences that affected family members are going through and how they're building hope and resilience along the way. Also exploring these relationships with culturally diverse populations or in different cultural contexts could reveal important variations or commonalities in the data, especially when we're looking at how different cultures experience and move through ambiguous loss differently. And then we also believe that intervention testing, like developing and evaluating hope and resilience building programs for family members, how they could also broaden the research of this population. And also thinking about this amazing platform that we've been given through you guys to present to so many different people across the world, looking at expanding our research to international collaboration, kind of looking at how family-centered ambiguous loss might extend across contexts and in systems around the world. So let me know if you'd like to collaborate on some international research together. We will drop our emails at the end. So just to wrap it up here, I think reflecting on my own experiences, both as a clinician working with affected family members and also as an affected family member myself, I think the findings from this study have shown us that ambiguous loss is a meaningful and a measurable experience for family members that are really affected by their loved one's substance use disorders. An aspect, again, that we have both personally witnessed in ourselves and in our own clinical work. And then we were also super excited to see how the statistical evidence of our study reinforced qualitative research already out there. Like everyone says, we were not surprised by our research findings, that hope and resilience are significant protective factors for ambiguous loss and how they can also be beneficial across different demographics. And then another takeaway that we hope that you got from this webinar today was that helping clients name and validate their ambiguous loss experience can help them just reclaim their own sense of agency and their own experience. And then, of course, evidence-based interventions like solution-focused therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and of course, psychoeducation can all be integrated not into just counseling, but also supervision and training, and that ethical and policy frameworks just kind of have to evolve to explicitly support our affected family members, and that we can all be advocates for that wherever we are. So what is one thing that you learned from today's webinar that you'd like to bring back into your own clinical practice, research, program development, or in the context of policy? Were you guys paying attention? The AFM experience, the importance of hope in building resilience, naming, validating that it's chronic. Oh, adding AL to like assessments. Yeah, narrative reframing. Positioning ambiguous loss in the experience of an AFM. Yeah. Just grief, tools and scales to measure. A new concept. Yay. Thanks for sharing.
Lexi, I think. Okay.
Naming and explaining. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, so that's our webinar. Thanks for being here and taking the time wherever you are in the world. So just wanted to open up the floor for questions or comments, whether that's in the chat or if you wanted to unmute yourself. Thank you for the claps.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure that you just chose the right platform with AFINet for your talk, because there are many open doors for what you just brought up. And I'm quite sure there will be several questions or comments. So if you have any questions or comments, you can use the raise your hand function, or you could type them in the chat. And
You
well,
see,
maybe
Ken has had his hand up for some time.
Okay, I also apparently can't see this from.
So Ken, his hand's gone down, but oh, what's up?
Good. I don't know. I do hear an echo on my part, so.
There's a big echo. I don't know why.
Mhm. Aber hier sehe ich nichts. Well, apparently we got some technical issues.
Try speaking again, Ken.
Testing.
Sorry, do you know why we have an echo?
Oh, that seems to have solved it, Richard. I don't get one now, so wonderful magic. It's so nice to see everybody. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and really just hitting on so many points. I am really curious your thoughts on, well, first, just the importance of ambiguous loss and how you both see positioning ambiguous loss in the bigger context of grief, in the process of grieving. Why I raised that, it was really interesting seeing what influences the severity of ambiguous loss. And I wonder, sometimes the narratives can be that when we think of protective factors, the thing that we're asking people to be protected from is just a very part of the normal human experience of wrestling with these situations. So how you think about helping people notice they are experiencing ambiguous loss and they are grieving as a response to that, and the normalization of that in how you guide people. Because I don't even know from your perspective if the normal grief models map on totally to how families are dealing with grief around ambiguous loss. So just to love get your take on that. And again, thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Yeah, so I always just turn it back to what the literature says. Dr. Pauline Boss has done extensive work on ambiguous loss since the 70s. And then she's done a lot of qualitative research around that. So when I'm working with clients to help them name that experience, I just go back to like describing the differences between physical ambiguous loss and psychological ambiguous loss. When someone is physically present and psychologically absent versus when someone is psychologically present and physically absent, like in cases of immigration. And then, yeah, I mean, there's also a lot of extensive research on ambiguous loss with family members and caregivers of people with dementia, actually, where again, the person is physically present and psychologically absent and sort of moving through grief there, where, I mean, that's also ambiguous loss. And then there's also like anticipated grief, especially for someone struggling with dementia. But when I'm explaining it to clients, I just go back to ye old like physical versus psychological ambiguous loss and what that looks like, and really just naming that for them. Your loved one is physically present and psychologically absent. And just even again, a simple statement like you are grieving someone that's still here, and just like letting them sit with that tends to help. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry. Go. Is there just a compass for how you grieve then? Is that kind of where you bring people, which is what is the process of grief and how you work through that?
Yeah, it's messy and it's all very tangled. And like you said, it's just sitting with those feelings of discomfort and using those CBT-based radical acceptance strategies that I accept my reality for what it is, even though I don't like it and it's uncomfortable.
I think, Ken, too, validating their experience, it gives them, giving them a name. That's what I find with clients. It's like giving them a name of what this is because they don't really understand it. And, there's still a lot of, I was just talking to a client yesterday that's been in recovery for 2.5 years. And they have never told anybody, unless the closest people with them, that they struggled with addiction because of the shame of it. So even though we think we're moving forward, we're not moving forward as fast as we need to of understanding that it's a disease. So they do not get support. People often look, if it's a parent or a loved one, they look at them like they have some responsibility for their loved one having that addiction. So validating that experience that you are going through this, you are grieving, your partner, your child, your grandchild. That part for me, it's like I feel a weight lifted off of them when they can name what it is. And then we talk through it and we grieve those different aspects of it. But as Alexei said, helping them kind of just be okay with the jacuzzi of uncertainty setting in it is really important.
Thank you.
I see there's also one comment and one question in the chat. The comment by Karen Wedlock is that also ambiguous loss through supporting families who are diagnosed with terminal illnesses, cancer, motor neuron disease, and the like. I think this is also helpful. And one question regarding your study by Afrin Jala, if you accounted for historical ongoing substance use by the affected family members themselves, and if not, if you have any thoughts on how this might have affected your findings.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So whenever I was going through what sort of questions I was going to ask for demographic purposes, I only asked about like if they are currently employed, if they went to, I think I remember, okay, gosh, it was like 2 years ago, but definitely it was like, are you in a relationship, and do you have a job, and sort of like vocational educational background, because the research out there says that affected family members themselves, as they're sort of grieving their loss, the psychological loss of their loved one, as well as just kind of being maybe a little codependent in trying to save them in the process. Sometimes they lose their job, or they quit school, or their own relationships suffer, or something that also came up in the literature is exactly what you asked about, or they start abusing substances themselves. So that is definitely something that I mentioned in my literature review of my dissertation, but not anything that I specifically messed with in when I was asking those demographic questions, as Dr. Rice taught me. Dr. Rice is my dissertation chair. She said a done dissertation is a good dissertation, right? And then after you're a professor and you have that platform, then you expand on that. But definitely something that I would love to expand on is, all other factors that affect the affected family member experience. But I do have thoughts that it's there, and also the literature out there says that they do use substances themselves just to cope.
Yeah, and just some logistical things too. With Qualtrics, we're not allowed to ask anything about substance use with Qualtrics. We would have to go, yeah, they have very fine lines about the type of questions you could ask on the surveys so we can't ask anything about substance use or the type of drugs that a person takes. We would have to go through NADAC or another organization, which I have done with other doctoral students that I wanted to ask specific questions. So there's some logistical things too. Alexia did bring it up, but being a good chair, I kept it where it was something feasible for her to do for this. But it would have to be another avenue to get that part of the information.
But the question remains, what do you think, if given that some people will have had previous substance problems themselves and some people may have current substance problems, how do you think that might have impacted on your research findings?
So I'll go first, Alexa, if you want, since I'm already unmuted. So I'm going to speak from personal and clinical experience and the base and thing. I find that people that have are affected family members, there's two main paths I see. One is I'm never going to try anything because I saw what it did. And so there's complete not trying, complete sobriety. In Native American culture, we call it walking the red road, which you don't use anything, you don't do anything. And then you know the other people that do try it, and then because we completely don't understand addiction, why some people try something and get addicted and some people don't. We still haven't quite figured that out. Some people will, and they're like, I can manage it. And then there's more a judgment about the person that has the addiction because they're like, well, I stopped, I can stop, or them themselves become addicted. And everything, and I see this with my clients, I turned out just like my mother. I turned out just like my auntie. Why did I do that? So I think there's probably going to be a correlation of how it impacts. I just think they're going to be those two paths, just in my opinion. Alexia?
Yeah, I think in the research findings too, whether that's the numerical values that we got from our research study, but also qualitative findings from previous research, is that ambiguous loss freezes the grief process. Add substances to that, you're numbing it. I mean, you're completely freezing it, right? And so, which means that I'm just not feeling it at all. So maybe that would have affected our findings in that maybe those people wouldn't want to complete our research study, or if anything, there would have been a correlation is in I'm feeling ambiguous loss and I'm also not feeling any hope and resilience. So that would have also kind of tracked with our numerical values. Yeah.
Bridget.
Ah, you can see that one. Well, lots of things. I've actually got a large number of questions, but I won't ask them all. Firstly, it was a lovely presentation, so thank you very much. And the reason why I asked you to do the presentation in the first place was because it was a really interesting study. And I think that this is an area where there's a lot of qualitative work, as you said. And it's really very nice to see a large quantitative sample. So huge congratulations for that. I thought your presentation was lovely because it's also great to be interactive. I don't think in our 40 previous webinars, we've actually had anyone who's done what you did. And when you said it was going to be interactive, I would think I wrote to you and said, gosh, that's going to be difficult. How are you going to do that in a webinar like this? And you demonstrated how wonderful it is. I'm going to look up this system because it's something we could use for other ones. So again, huge congratulations. And I think moving on to your findings, I mean, I think ambiguous loss is an incredibly helpful conceptualization. One of my questions is related to how ambiguous loss in bereavement is related, because obviously you're looking at ambiguous loss in terms of people who are, in a sense, experiencing a partial bereavement, either physically or psychologically, as you say, but actually the person is still alive. But there's quite a lot of research looking into ambiguous loss in bereavement and how people get stuck in their loss situation when they're bereaved, and how that's a big problem for a lot of people to get out of. So I'm interested in any comments you have about the relationship between ambiguous loss in actual bereavement and relationship with ambiguous loss when somebody hasn't yet died. But one of the issues is people's concerns and worries and fears that they're going to die. Moving on to your study, I'm amazed, and it's wonderful that you got an almost 50% male-female split. You will know that in most research into affected family members, it's very difficult to get anything like a 50% split. There's a huge preponderance of women, or a huge lack of men coming forward for either qualitative or quantitative work. So the fact you managed to get such a really good balance is fantastic, and hugely well done. I'd love to know if you did anything to do that, or whether it's pure chance that those are the people who actually responded. And just, I won't go through all my questions, but I'm very interested in you saying we need to consider cultural competences, particularly in more collectivist cultures, when we think about how we deal with ambiguous loss. And I'm interested in what you think we should do differently in collectivist cultures versus what we should do in more individualistic cultures. I'll stop there, give somebody else a chance.
Those were such great questions. Okay, I'm going to make sure that I can go through all of them. The first one being, how is this different or aligns with just the term bereavement? We find that also ambiguous loss is in that pool of disenfranchised grief, when grief goes unrecognized, whether that's like maybe the death of a pet or just the death of something that maybe I can't take off work from. So definitely it's in that pool of I'm grieving and I kind of feel ashamed about this grief because, again, this person is still physically present. So this person hasn't actually died. But yeah, there's when we look at ambiguous loss, well, I guess when I started my literature review, sort of that's how I went down that rabbit hole. Is I started with grief and bereavement, and then kind of went down to ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief, what grief looks like, disenfranchised grief and ambiguous loss. What does that look like in the context of disappearances or immigration or being deployed, versus what does it look like when someone is going through dementia, or someone else mentioned here in the chat like chronic diseases, or when there's like that almost like anticipated grief of, I know, this person might pass soon, and then there's that anticipation of that. What was your second question? Was, gosh, I remember the third one. I can't remember the
second one was how did you get so many males?
Oh, yes. Okay, so yeah, so that is actually something that I mentioned in the limitations section of my research, whereas Qualtrics, again, was an online platform, and I'm like, I wonder what it would have looked like, because I'm pretty sure Qualtrics pays their participants in some kind of way. So it definitely like incentivized people to share about their experiences. So that was also one of the limitations of my study. Another limitation being that it was an online survey. So again, I mean, that the participants that we had were mainly 35 to 44 years old. So maybe people that are more inclined to use technology to complete an assessment, versus maybe if I had gone into an actual rehab and interviewed family members there and run assessments there. So I think that, I mean, yeah, just using Qualtrics, lots of benefits, huge sample size, but also a limitation of, sort of like the people that were interested in taking that study. And
do you have to pay Qualtrics?
Yes.
Is it expensive?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was definitely worth it. I mean, Dr. Rice and I went back and forth about using Qualtrics, but I mean, the huge sample size was such a gem.
Yeah. Oh, well, actually, I'm going to ask a related. I know there's another question, but I want to ask a related question about the sample. You mentioned a number of groups, and obviously, the age you had the largest group in the mid range, and you had quite a lot of spouses and partners. You had you didn't mention as a group parents. And that's quite interesting because in most research, the two big groups are parents, probably bigger, and then spouses, and the others are usually generally smaller. But in yours, you had the biggest group you had was spouses, and then you had people who were extremely good friends. So parents represented a smaller group for you?
Yeah, which again speaks to sort of the platform that we used for our data collection was an online platform, and based on the demographics and the age demographics, also seeing that maybe those people were more inclined to complete an online survey, but definitely biggest was spouse and then best friends with that 17 or 14%. But yeah, especially if I were to walk into a family group at a rehab, maybe to have more parents.
I mean,
Yeah,
I
but
think
when
I think you'll get a lot more, fun enough, a lot more ambiguous loss in the parent group than you will
Sure.
with other groups, because I think for parents in particular, having a child or a grandchild with a major addiction problem is a much bigger sense of loss because people have such strong fantasies about how their children will turn out, how their grandchildren will turn out. And those are stronger than the fantasies you might have about a friend or even about a partner.
No, for sure. It's where did my son go?
Yes,
Right? The
yes,
hope that you had for them to
yeah,
be XYZ and then they're
exactly.
not.
And I'm sure in your counselling work, you come across a lot of parents who said exactly that, and certainly I have.
For sure. And then going to your third question about kind of cultural contexts in our clinical work, I thought that was important to note, especially living in the United States, where we're such an individualistic society, where we're focusing on, clients themselves, developing that individual sense of agency. And as counselor educators, we always talk about cultural context and realizing that like not everyone has this Western mentality of me, and really thinking about what does that look like for, I'm Hispanic. And so, I mean, I come from a very different culture where it's not me. And if I'm me, I'm kind of being a little selfish about it. And I got to think about my family. And so we always make sure to add multicultural considerations in all the work that we do and thinking about, what building your own sense of agency looks like while also accounting for family dynamics.
So how does that change your practice when you're seeing somebody, a family member from a Hispanic collectivist culture, for example, as opposed to seeing somebody from a Northern European background?
Well, definitely accounting for the importance of family and making sure to ask the client if they would like their family member to join a session, and making sure those consent forms are signed and allowing for maybe more family sessions to happen than normal.
Yeah. In Native American culture, they have a thing called tolerated illness that we don't talk to anybody about what's going on in our family because we have to protect our family because historically there's been things that have happened that have been pathologized. And so even when I told my dad I was going to go to a graduate school to be a counselor, he said, "You don't talk to strangers about your problems. You keep it in the family." So I think in a way for Alexia and I'll speak a little for Alexia. I think proper self-disclosure helps when I'm working with other Native American families and other collectivists is that I say, I get it. I understand. Like we're not supposed to talk about it. We're supposed to keep it in the family. We're supposed to tolerate it because we don't want negative things to come onto our tribe or our people. But but we can validate an experience and both can be true. We can love our family and support our family, and we can also be frustrated at times or feel this loss. And so it's kind of connecting that for them that they are not in any way disparaging the collective of the family, the unit. the tribe and kind of normalizing it for them and giving it voice to that, I think is helpful, I find.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, as far as I see, we're slowly running out of time and quite a lot of people are leaving, but still I have one invitation and 1.5 questions. So starting with the invitation, I think especially with your conclusions regarding the necessity of improving support for affected family members, this is something that has been on the AFINet agenda for quite a while, and so you're wholeheartedly invited to participate. And if you have got any information or are looking for exchange, you can also use stuff like the newsletter of AFINet. So getting more in touch with the AFINet community, which is more than 1,000 people from almost 60 countries so far. But having said this, to move over to my question, I did quite a lot of, policy stuff in Germany, and usually when it gets to improve treatment services, the first question is usually, well, what does it cost if we leave them untreated, and how expensive is it to improve their situation? And for example, you got great data from the US, from Kaiser Permanente, Connie Weisner, and the like about higher healthcare costs of family members, which might probably be a bit more convincing to people who are not into research, but are policymakers, to say we need more resources in the field. And I think one of the key issues might be the elevated rates of depression, which would fit perfectly with the concept of ambiguous loss. And so question one, what are your thoughts about the association of, depression and the like, and ambiguous loss? And the second one, which also is important to improve, support services, is what I missed a bit was a reference to a bulk of literature on evidence-based interventions for family members, like CRAFT or the 5-step approach and the like. And I just wonder if this probably might improve your standing if you include it into your concept. Or, of course, behavioral couples therapy, not to be forgotten, which... So what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And that's why, sorry, I hear a little bit of an echo. Can you guys hear an echo, or is it just me?
Yeah, there is an echo. There is an echo.
Oh, hello. Okay, I think it's better. In my dissertation, I included the NCCAP Code of Ethics, which is the American Code of Ethics for addictions counselors. And I mentioned how the word family is only used in that Code of Ethics in the context of dual relationships or in the context of assessment. And it was honestly a call to action for the NCCAP Code of Ethics of, like, maybe if you just included the word family support in there, it would sort of motivate rehabilitation centers to follow that Code of Ethics of just having more family support groups. But like you said, what does that look like for billing purposes and for policymakers? I mean, it was just really a call to action for addiction counselors to include family members more in treatment. But you're right, what does that look like in terms of billing, or if we look at just depression as a whole, or just even addiction as a public health issue for our family members? I know, Dr. Rice, if you have more to say about that.
I think, yeah, policy is, I mean, I'm a very practical person, and in the US, a lot of it's what insurance will pay for. It's just, that's the result of it. So we can add in those things, but I have a really hard time family with insurance paying for some things. And so it's either us taking it out of pocket. Alexia's shaking her head. Everything in the US is about CIP codes and how we bill with insurance, and they don't really support family therapy. What I believe would be beneficial is when people go into inpatient treatment, which is how typically in the US, when that's the first thing, is from the beginning, there's some allowances for training for the family members on ambiguous loss and understanding it, just not that 28 days that the client is coming in. There's some resources made available. And I think that preventative care from the beginning of talking to them in the US, in my opinion, in the US, we're not the best with the preventative care. We're more reactionary care. Other countries and other systems might be better with the preventative, but basically that's what we're talking about, is like explaining you just found out your child has an addiction. Listen, these are some of the things that might occur. That's not really done. The focus is on the person with the addiction. And I am so sorry, but I have another meeting to go to and I have to leave. So I so apologize. It was lovely chatting with everybody. So appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. And unfortunately, there is one hand still up, but I think
that's
we're running
okay.
out of time.
Alexia, can you stay?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, great. So thank you,
Bye,
Kathleen, and
everybody.
see you. So I would say last question from Catherine Richardson. If it is a question, you're still muted. Not sure whether this happened accidentally. There's also nothing in the chat. Well, okay, so appears there's one leftover hand here. So once more, thank you so much, and we are very sure that your talk will be seen by far more people than who have been attended this today at our website. And all the best of luck for your further research, and let's keep in contact.
For sure. Thank you guys so much, and you guys have all of our contact information. Oh, I think raised hand.
Catherine's come back.
Yeah.
Catherine, do you want to say something? As I took your hand down and you put it back up again. Hello, Catherine.
Well,
Maybe not.
might also be some technical issues. I had them myself today, so can happen to everyone. Okay, so thank you very much. And Richard, I'm sure you've got the dates from the next webinar. I do not have them.
In fact, I've just will probably finalize tomorrow or the next day the November one and the January one. So in the next week, both of those will go onto the website. Obviously, we do have an echo, don't we? We don't have one in September. We normally have every 2 months. We don't have one in September because of the conference, and therefore the next one will be in November, and the one after that will be January, and both of those we are just about to finalize.
Right, and for all of you interested in our online conference, which will take place on September 15 and 16, more information can be found on the website. So thank you all for being here, and see you at the conference or the next webinar. And big thank you to Richard for organizing all these webinars throughout all the years.
It's a great pleasure. Particularly when it's as good as this one is today.
Have a great evening, afternoon, or whatever, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.